people like to use the word godliness, and usually they use it in an erroneous way. It's typically applied to people in a caricature of what they think the embodiment of godliness is. But godliness doesn't always look like people paint it, all right? And let me give an example of this. So when people talk about giving time, giving money, there is an element to that which, if a person properly understands the Word of God, you are never going to look on giving the same way ever again. You're going to look at it as an activity that God has activated within you that is not normal to most of us, right? God does that. And it becomes somewhat of a gift of grace that you know that by nature we're not givers. So when people talk about money, giving, ministry, I think a lot of times the idea is that couldn't be, or that could not be put in the camp with godly activities because they somehow equate money with something out in the world. But in reality, if you think about the spirit that moves a person to give, that is a godly activity. So when people talk about this ministry, for example, no, we're not like other ministries. I don't come here and play at being spiritual or religious. I come here for one singular purpose. God placed a calling on my life to open up the Word of God, no matter how simple or how complicated the subject matter is. And to me, someone who keeps showing up week after week, regardless of the things that they may face, that looks like godliness as well, okay? And then you move into a category of understanding, because this came up in a conversation over the weekend, or a discussion, and it got me to thinking, you know, the Bible talks about David being a man after God's own heart, and that would kind of equate him with being a godly man. And yet if you look at his activities, he covets the wife of another, kills the husband. I mean, there's a whole plethora of things that, if you look at his life, do not look godly, and yet he's equated with being a man after God's own heart. So that tells me that the caricatured version of godliness is something we fantasize and we pervert and we make into what we want it to be versus what actually God assigned it to be. Look at all the people in the Bible. You've got Moses, who obviously born of a Levite family but given up as a child, raised in the riches of Egypt. And if you study his life, you know that he murders a man, maybe not the most honorable if we're going to look at, or most godly, and yet God chooses him to be the godly leader of the children of Israel. So what does godliness look like? Well, in the church, it looks like people who freely, without coercion, without some strings, have the Spirit in them. That Spirit motivates them to give, motivates them to attend, motivates them to participate, motivates them to learn this book. Godliness is not an appearance. It is not a sound, an oration, stained glass tones. If that is what you classify as godliness, you and I should part ways right now. That is a man-made, I'll just repeat it again, a caricature. But if I study the lives of the people in this book, touched by God, they are not perfect. They are not people that you would look at and say, oh, they qualify for the church board because they're so spiritually righteous. But rather, when you see how God moves through a person, and that movement can be in mindset, your focus, the Word of God, giving, your activities, your life, your family, whatever that is, and it does not appear in the version that most people paint as godliness. So when I talk about this, I don't care. Sorry, not sorry. I don't care if you have an idea of what godliness is or what godliness looks like. Chances are it is a perversion of what God describes in his book, each and every person that is described as a godly leader, as moved by God, is equally a faulty, sinning, sin-stained container under the, we'll call it the movement of God, but definitely if you saw them walking down the street, you wouldn't say, oh, that is a godly person, just by the way we classify that. Now, I think my calling in ministry is to clean up a lot of the scabbala that's peddled on so many people in a mass way. And you may say, but you, Pastor Scott, sound like the lone voice. You sound like the only one saying this. Well, I may be doing that. I may be one of the few. Maybe I'm alone. I have no idea. But I'm not going to change my tune because the multitude say that and they do that. When I read this book, it shows me what godliness looks like. And when I see people who are giving without any motivation other than they understand why they're giving, what the word says on that, that's godliness, friends. Somebody who prays and they don't do it in public and they don't do it as a spectacle, and maybe they are by themselves in a dark room or whatever doing it, and that's godliness. No one knows about your godly activities except God. And when you get that straight, you'll quit making Christianity some special put on display act that we should all play versus the genuine article that is moved by the Spirit of God, that is controlled by the Spirit of God, and that acts upon the urges of the Spirit of God, period. You know, the reason why this is important to me, it's interesting. God sometimes will put people in my path or in conversations, and I realize that's not something I've addressed. And it concerns me because when people talk about this ministry, they'll often point out how, I'll say it this way, how unconventional Pastor Scott is. But in reality, if you look really close, actually you don't have to look that close. I maybe look more, and I'm not saying this to blow or toot my own horn, but I may look more like the people in this book, sinners who knew they were sinners, messed up, and they knew they were messed up, and knew they couldn't do it without God. And when you have that mindset, you understand everything else that's peddled on you from the church is just nothing but a bunch of garbage, where people start thinking they're missing out. They're not living on that level of highness. No one lives there except for, I'm just going to say it, except for the bullshitters, okay? No one lives there. Wait. So what it does is it sets you up to think you're not achieving that standard, when in fact, you showing up every Sunday, or you calling in, or you opening your book and reading, or praying, or giving, all of that is God and godly activity that translates to me into a godly person, godliness, if you will, and not all the other stuff that's the exterior coatings that people would like to say, now that's a Christian. No, the one with the exterior coating to me is nothing but a show for the devil, and I'm not participating. Now that we've got that cleared up, so when somebody asks me, what about giving? I'm telling you, I look on it the same way. I don't look on it as some necessary evil I have to talk about. And some people have asked me, why don't I teach more? And I may. But I will tell you this, when Gene Scott covered, I don't know, probably almost a year's worth of giving messages, I think you could probably listen and reread those. And I'm not saying that I can't say it better or differently, because I could definitely say it differently. But there's so much of that material on the website that you should at least be trying to take in one lesson a week, that those lessons are actually life-changing. They change the way you look at and perceive everything that God has blessed you with. And don't stop at your pocketbook. You know the best place to start is? the air in your lungs that gives you the ability to get up every day and to walk around and to breathe, to speak, to communicate, that's the first place you start. And then you work your way through everything that God's blessed you with, and you realize every day is a gift, everything that comes into my hands is a gift, and the way I treat all of this, guess what? God's looking on. That's another form, by the way, of godliness, is how you treat those things that God has blessed you with. So, all I have to say is that when I think of these things, yes, we are very different here. And when I say very different, I mean, I'm not into trying to win over friends or influence people or trying to get people out there to like me. I'm trying to get people to learn the Word of God, what's really there, not all the stuff that's been attached, not all the stuff we've been kind of pressed into believing, but what really matters and what really counts for eternity. That's why I stand here in front of you. So if people are looking for something a little bit more spiritual or godly or holy, please go somewhere else. You won't find what you're looking for here, because that is the caricature or the mirage. I'm presenting to you what I call the stuff that is where the rubber meets the road and where you can actually do something with it.
Come to this house, magnify the Lord, lift up holy hands, our hearts in one accord, worship and bow down before Him, exalt His name today. Come into this house,